Also expecting him to talk about the kind of volunteer work that counts, what kinds of organizations, how many hours you have to work in order to qualify for that money, all part of course, trying to support students at a time when it is much more difficult to find any kind of employment for students included. Let me bring in my colleagues, the host of Power and Politics, Vashi Kapelos, and the CBC's Catherine Cullen, to talk more about what we're expecting to hear from the Prime Minister and, of course, the kinds of questions he will get, which, while some might be related to this, we would expect other topics to come up as well. Vashi, particularly around that letter that your show reported on last night from 19 former parliamentarians and well-known Canadians calling for the government to do more to help Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor be released from a Chinese prison.
Yeah, this conversation has really evolved this week on the heels, of course, of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor getting charged last Friday, nearly a week ago, in China with essentially spying. A producer on our show, Brendan McDonald, was able to obtain that letter. 19 very prominent political figures from a wide range of political parties, everyone from Alan Rock to Ed Broadbent to Lawrence Cannon, former Conservative Foreign Affairs Minister, Derek Burney, former U.S. ambassador, Canadian ambassador rather, to the U.S. and obviously worked in the Brian Mulroney government for a long time as well. So wide range of people that you wouldn't, I think the reason that this letter has really sort of hit a nerve is because you wouldn't expect necessarily all those names on the letter. And the gist of the letter is essentially consider this opinion, this legal opinion that was sent by Michael Kovrig's family to the government back on May 22nd, which says you have the option as Justice Minister to intervene in the extradition case against Meng Wanzhou to end it, essentially, before it concludes. So the Justice Minister has long maintained at the end of the process, there is a role for the Justice Minister to either sign off on the extradition or not, and they have a very specific set of reasons that they can do that. What this legal opinion has said, one that the family appears to support as it's sent over to the Prime Minister, is that no, actually, you don't have to give a reason and you can intervene before then. Now, obviously, the argument against that is this is essentially could be perceived as giving in to hostage diplomacy and set a very dangerous precedent for the relationship between Canada and the U.S. But the gist of what all these political figures are saying is you should be considering this. You shouldn't be dismissing it out of hand, which is how they perceive the government has, I guess, addressed the issue so far. They all admit that the discussion around should you intervene is perhaps a more complicated one, but the letter argues that, yes, you should intervene. You should, not only can you, but should you? The Prime Minister so far has very much said that is not an option. He was specific the last time he gave a press conference. I think it was Monday, if I'm not correct. Hopefully I'm correct there. Yeah. He was asked about a position actually originally John Manley had put forth months ago, and now it appears John Manley certainly isn't alone. As I mentioned, tons of other political people who are not just former Liberals, which is how it had been characterized before. So I think there will be a number of very pointed questions, not only because of who signed this letter, but the fact that the family sent that legal opinion, Michael Kovrig's family sent that legal opinion to the Prime Minister. They haven't received a response yet. My understanding is there is some frustration there. So I do expect a number of questions to the Prime Minister on this. I would be shocked if his position changes, because he has been very consistent in refuting the idea that there will be any kind of political intervention before the point at which they perceive that is possible, which is at the end of all court proceedings.
Yeah, Catherine, it is interesting, and I agree. I don't think the Prime Minister's position will change. The position has been we have a justice system that is independent from the political system. We will let things unfold as they are supposed to, and we don't plan to intervene at any point. And I guess the critics' view of this letter and these kinds of positions is once you show your hand to China that you're willing to quote unquote bend, what kind of leverage does it give China going forward?
And not just China, right?
And not just China, but also, and then also what happens if they don't release the Michaels? If you release Meng Wanzhou and you move away from that and China doesn't reciprocate, it puts the government as well in, I mean, it's a terrible situation regardless, but it puts them in an awkward position in that case too.
And it's interesting to consider what all of this debate and attention over the course of the past week, which of course was ratcheted up last Friday when China announced that it was charging Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor with spying, but what all of this additional attention attention has or hasn't done for the case of the two men. I mean, certainly the tone has gone up, ratcheted up once again between both the Prime Minister and officials that we're hearing on the Chinese side, who have called the Prime Minister, for instance, irresponsible. Now, we did hear the other day from officials in China that there is perhaps a bit of good news for the Michaels, that they are looking at returning consular access to them. Certainly, we know Michael Kovrig family was encouraged to hear that. They haven't had consular access since, I believe it is January, and the Chinese officials have cited COVID-19 as the reason for that. But we know that they're living in very difficult conditions right now, and that is certainly something that both families and Canadian officials have wanted to see. But also just this discussion, and we can, I think, absolutely understand why people who are concerned for the well-being of these two men are bringing up this option. They see this situation as something of a political stalemate. They see a way out, and on the other hand, they see a situation that could go on for years as Meng Wanzhou's extradition hearing plays out. But at the same time, it does send a message to China, and we're seeing this in the words of the Foreign Ministry spokesperson, that this is possible, that this is a route that Canada can pursue. And so China has responded by saying, listen, this is being raised, just do it. It becomes a bit complex because, of course, on the one hand, China has largely denied that it is linking the case of the two Michaels and Meng Wanzhou, but at the same time, I think it is widely understood that those two things do seem to be linked, and there are particular instances we can point to where Chinese officials seem to be linking them. So the tension is ratcheted up. There is no clear, way to exit this. I know on Vashti's show on Friday, the head of the International Crisis Group, which employs Michael Spavor, said this whole crisis is political. The only situation, the only way these men will be freed, that is going to have to be a political solution as well. But what that solution will be remains to be seen. And as Vashti said, it would be a surprise, certainly, if the Prime Minister's tone changed today.
Okay, but he will get questions nonetheless. All right, I will come back to you shortly, if you don't mind, because the other part of the story that we are watching today, the COVID-related part of the story, is the fact that global infections are surging. The total is now rapidly closing in on 10 million, with almost 500,000 deaths. It took 3 months for the world to get to 1 million cases. So the most recent million case increase took just 6 days. Dr. Brenda Coleman is an infectious disease epidemiologist, and she joins us now from Toronto. Doctor, good to see you. Appreciate you being here. Obviously, this is very troubling, even as we seem to have got a hold on the number of cases in Canada. It's particularly troubling when we look south of the border to see what almost looks like another wave in the United States, although it also just seems to be the virus moving into places where it hadn't been contained. So maybe we can start there. Give me your read on what you think is happening in the U.S.
So I do think that's what's going on, is that we're having infections in places that hadn't seen very many before. We're also doing a little better job of testing for them. So I think that's a big part of us seeing 1 million cases in a few short days, is that supplies are out there, testing capabilities are out there, and we're doing a better job of getting out and looking at those. However, we also are seeing a surge of cases in places that they haven't been seen before, and it is troubling. We are going to have to start keeping an eye on, we're going to have to continue to, this is unfortunate for the people in the travel industry, but we're going to have to keep restrictions on travel.
Yeah, I was going
like that.
Yeah, the border, the Canada-U.S. border, remains closed to non-essential travel to the end of July. When I look at the numbers today in the United States, to me, I wonder when the border will ever open at this point. Is that fair to say, given that huge spike in cases, even if they're not border states?
Exactly. We are going to have to keep an eye on that. If we want to keep our numbers down, one of the best ways of doing it is make sure we're not importing any cases from elsewhere.
The WHO is also raising the alarm on Europe case levels. And of course, many of our original cases came from Europe, people returning from vacation in Europe. What are your concerns around the rise in cases in Europe?
It's the same thing. I think that we're starting to loosen our restrictions, and we need to loosen them a certain amount because people are tired of being stuck inside and not being able to do things. But we have to be careful about how quickly we do that, and people have to continue to have safe practices even though the restrictions are lifted somewhat. We have to follow what public health is telling us in order to keep the number of cases down. There are cases out there. It will be transmitted between people. This is a very easily transmitted virus, so we have to be vigilant. But we can't be stuck indoors forever, so we need to think about how we can mitigate infections in the community when we're out and about.
But what is the lesson for Canada? I mean, you see, for instance, in Florida, where it seemed around Memorial Day, they were sort of easing back on the restrictions for all sorts of reasons, some of which you're talking about there. And people were gathering. There were lots of people at the beach. I mean, what are the lessons for here as we reopen and are in different phases of that across this country?
So we have to pay attention to what public health officials are telling us. It's a lot safer to be outside than it is inside, and if people need to gather, being outside is a good idea. However, when we are outside and with each other, we need to keep those physical distancing ideas in our heads, right? Mm-hmm. We can go ahead and talk with people, but stay 6 feet away. Make sure that you wash your hands every time you turn around to make sure that you're not infecting yourself, right? And do those sorts of things. So those are the sort of things. And I think public health is doing a very good job of telling us how to make sure that we're keeping ourselves safe.
Okay, Dr.
What they're telling us is good. It's just we have to stick with it.
We have to keep doing it. Yeah, that's the part that maybe is getting harder to do. Dr. Coleman,
it really is.
Thank you so much for reminding us about all that and weighing in on what we're seeing around the world right now. Appreciate it very much.
Take care.
Dr. Brenda Coleman, an infectious disease epidemiologist in Toronto, as we wait for the Prime Minister to emerge from his home. Been a couple of days now that he hasn't given a press conference, and that maybe is what we should expect heading into the summer months, of course. But today, we are expecting him to give some pretty important information to many students who have been waiting for this. Some 9 weeks ago, the federal government announced this grant program for students who were going to volunteer and somehow be rewarded financially for that by the federal government. So the Prime Minister will outline a little bit how that will work today. And I'll bring back Vashti and Catherine as we wait for him. We know that students young people have been obviously really hard hit in the employment numbers because of the pandemic. Lots of people trying to pick up, in the summer months they would try and pick up part-time work or at restaurants and none of that work exists now. So they do have a student benefit, an emergency relief benefit they can use, although many students are also using the CERB if they qualify for it. But this plan, this volunteer program, was intended to give them another place where they could go and help the fight against COVID and get some money in return, Vashi.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. You mentioned off the top, Rosie, earlier that a number of students have contacted you. Same here. Lots of students are really interested in this program, and they have been for a couple of months trying to figure out, after the initial announcement, if their volunteer work that, for example, they already do would qualify, if they have to look to a different organization. I'll give you one example. I think the day that it was announced, Minister Qualtrough was on our show. We asked her, we had another student there who volunteered for the Kids Help Phone. Will that qualify? And she said yes at the time. So that's one concrete thing. But today, you're absolutely right. There's a whole bunch of details that students are looking for. Over what period? How many hours do I have to contribute? How do they figure out if I get 1,000 or 5,000 or what it is in between? Does the organization qualify? Does the nonprofit I work for even now qualify? I mean, there are a whole host of questions that I know a lot of people are anxiously awaiting, and I think those details, the plan is, at least from what I've told, that we will get all those details today. On the other 2 points that you made about the sort of need for financial help from students, that's a really interesting question too, and our colleague Janice McGregor mined through some of the data so far. It looks like 580,000 students in and around there have qualified for the student version of CERB, which was $1,250 a month for up to 4 months. And then if you have a disability or a dependent, you can get basically the equivalent of CERB, so $2,000 a month. So there you're looking at about 580,000. And then even more interesting, I thought that she found, was the number of people who have qualified for CERB itself. So not basically meaning that they earned more than $5,000 last year. A fifth of the applicants are between 15 and 24 years old. So a huge portion of the people who are accessing that benefit right now are students, and it also gives us an idea of what the need will be like through the extension of the program that the Prime Minister announced, I think it was last week. So for many people that runs out in a couple of weeks, or a week I guess now, but now that the program is extended, if this many people are young people who have accessed it, they may not have job prospects throughout the rest of the summer. Obviously it's a moving target, but essentially that need might be there for a little bit longer. So I found those two statistics really interesting. The total value of the package that the government announced announced was $9 billion. Clearly, there is a need for help among students. I think they're eagerly anticipating these details, though, to find out how their volunteer efforts might be compensated.
And they did. There were all sorts of aspects to that student package, including suspending repayment and interest on student loans, including doubling student grants. There were a variety of different things. Catherine, as we wait for the Prime Minister, who might come out any time, though, you actually did do some work on that, students actually not using the student benefit and using the other benefit instead.
That's right. I was speaking to a few student groups earlier this month, and one of the concerns that they were raising was the level of uptake of this particular student benefit. If you look at, for instance, the work done by the Parliamentary Budget Officer, that office suggested that 1.1 million students would be latching onto this benefit. And as Vashi just said, the latest figures show it's below the 600,000 mark. But students do have to decide whether they're eligible for CERB or whether they want to apply for the student benefit. You have to choose one or the other. Now, that said, student groups do say that they are hearing from their members that there is already a lot of anxiety about what is going to happen in the fall, the return to school, being able to pay their bills if they have indeed accessed the student benefit, and that money is no longer available to them. It's a 4-month process. And yet at the same time, we see the government today just announcing the rollout of this summer jobs plan. So it's certainly a very multifaceted issue. It's clear that there are some very real anxieties out there from students about how they're going to pay their bills, how they're going to pay tuition. Pieces of the puzzle certainly will be announced by the government today, but much of that focused on this summer. Although the money, I should say, the money for the student service grant will be used towards post-secondary education in the fall. But still, all that to say, certainly a lot of anxiety out there from some students, and we'll see how far today's announcement goes towards quelling some of that, or at least answering some questions.
Yeah, I wonder too if we'll find out soon enough, but the Canada Emergency Student Benefit that, as you talked about, Catherine, is from May to August, whether there would be any thought to extending that. Because lots of students, would still not be able to get part-time work, would not be able to, for instance, even get campus work, because presumably many of them won't be on campus. So I wonder if there's even any thought to extending that a couple of extra months as well.
Yeah, and another aspect to all of this, which you hear major student organizations talk about, is international students who are not eligible. They make up a sizable portion of Canadian students, and some of them have found themselves in very difficult situations. So that's another aspect of this that they would like to see covered. It really just points, Rosemary, to what a complex and intricate process the government has set up here as they try to cover off all the different groups of Canadians in need. And as Canadians ask themselves, okay, where do I fit in? What sort of benefits am I eligible for in order to make ends meet? And of course, the other thing we have to think about in all of this, you talk about what could happen in the fall. Second wave, we hate to say it, and yet so many experts say it's inevitable. So how would that play into employment prospects, for instance, that may already be dwindling over the summer or not? Yes, does the government have to look at an extension there, while it also contemplates just how long the extension is going to be on the emergency response benefit itself and how to try to move Canadians off of that? Again, a lot of moving parts here, and certainly a conundrum for the government and for Canadians who are in many cases depending on these benefits.
Okay, again, we are standing by for the Prime Minister, who will come out pretty soon. That's my wink wink for him to come out pretty soon. Yesterday, he was working from home and doing meetings, but he also did venture out in the afternoon with his son, Hadrian, who is 6 now, I think, probably. Hadrian will send me a note if that's wrong. I'm kidding. They went out for ice cream to celebrate Saint Jean-Baptiste yesterday, which is, of course, Quebec's their holiday, to celebrate their national holiday in Quebec. So he did have one public event, but he didn't take any questions and didn't have immediate availability per se. So this is the first time we've seen him since Monday. I will say there is another story out today that perhaps the Prime Minister will get asked about that is perhaps also not surprising, and that is that there was a study by looking at long-term care within OECD countries and finding that the proportion of deaths in long-term care in Canada is double the average of other nations. 81%, as we've talked about many times, of all reported deaths in this country happened in long-term care homes. You compare it to other countries within the OECD, and the average there is about half of that, about 42%. It comes at a time when we know the military no longer in Ontario long-term care centres, but Quebec and the government still figuring out what's going to happen next for that province, as the military members are also due to pull out. But in a broader context, Vashi, a conversation that we know will have to take place around how we are helping people, older Canadians, moving forward, because clearly there is something that is not working in this country and is much worse than it is in other countries.
Yeah, and that study is heartbreaking to read, obviously confirming what we have seen anecdotally and to a certain degree even statistically. When you highlight that number, 81% of all the deaths have occurred in long-term care homes. A couple of things that I think jump out at me in the discussion. First of all, we know that a number of provinces, Quebec and Ontario to name very specifically, have embarked on sort of a study, a review, an inquiry, a whole debate around what they're doing in that respect, but looking at what the actual problem is. But as far as addressing the solution in the short term or the long term, in Ontario, for example, the province has had to take over some of a number of these homes. We know the military is operating in both provinces, and there looks to be some discussion around a plan to replace the military in those homes with members of the Red Cross, but we don't know the details of that yet. So it's still very much an acute problem. Certainly the numbers have not increased the way that they were a few weeks ago or a few months ago, but it's still a pretty acute problem. And then you get to the more long-term solution, and that's where I think the discussions between the provinces and the federal government are going to be of great interest. And I should note that the call happens, that weekly call between the premiers and the Prime Minister tonight. We know, for example, there's this $14 billion on the table for stuff that's happening, basically, I think I'll say, in the next 6 months, let's say. So your health care costs in the next 6 months, that could include long-term care, child care issues, municipalities. There's 7 topics, basically, that the federal government wants this money to go towards, and they're very specific about it. The money was announced a little while ago. I'm going to say something like 3 weeks to a month ago.
Yeah, about 3 weeks.
Still, it has not been delivered. My understanding is that those conversations have not been altogether the most pleasant. While a number of premiers have said publicly, everyone's saying we appreciate the money. We just and I'm going to paraphrase, we don't want to be told what to do with it. We want, the word they keep using over and over again is flexibility. The federal government, the Prime Minister seems pretty set. We want this money to go to these certain areas. Those discussions have not been resolved yet. And I bring it up in the context of long-term care because part of what the premiers are really concerned about is more long-term funding for health care, right? They were already, prior to this pandemic, saying the portion of health care that the federal government pays through its transfers has decreased over the years. It should be a lot higher. They view this, at least every premier that I've spoken to and interviewed on the subject, they view this as central to addressing issues, more permanent and long-lasting issues with long-term care in the future, essentially fixing the problem over the long term. And they are almost predicating a lot of these discussions on some sort of assurance, wanting some sort of assurance from the federal government, which at this point wants to concentrate very much on the next 6 months, at least is where this money is concerned, and then get into discussions about long-term transfers. But these premiers are kind of digging their heels in, if I could say right now, around wanting to have more concrete commitments from the federal government about healthcare funding in the long term so that they can use a good portion of that money to address the crisis in long-term care homes. And as we wait for some sort of resolve there, we really don't have a concrete set of solutions to fix what's happening in these homes. We have interim measures in place that are above, and they're extraordinary, right? The military in these homes, the Red Cross in these homes, the province taking over these homes in order for them to be able to care for the people inside them. But that isn't a permanent solution.
No, okay.
And I think it's a, oh, never mind.
I got to cut you off. No, that was very
quiet.
good. Vashi, here's the Prime Minister of Canada.
Holiday yesterday. For many Quebecers and Francophones, Saint-Jean-Baptiste marks the beginning of summer. School is over, people have graduated, and summer jobs are beginning. But this year, it's a little bit different, of course, because of COVID-19. The reality is that there aren't as many jobs available for students as last year. And without a job, it's very difficult to pay your tuition or your daily expenses. So in April, we announced a plan plan, a $9 billion plan to support students and new graduates. That includes the Canada student benefit that gives them $1,500 a month until August. We also committed to creating 16,000 jobs for students in sectors where they need help at this time, and to introduce a program that would provide grants to people who get involved in their community. And today, we are following up on those commitments. We are launching the Canada Student Service Grant that will allow students to acquire skills and experience while contributing to their community. If you're a student in the cégep or university levels, or if you have decided to do some volunteering this summer, you can receive a grant of between $1,000 and $5,000. The exact amount will be determined based on the number of hours that you have worked between June 18th and September 15th. To find out more about this program and to look for opportunities in your region, go to the government site. Today, we are launching the I Want to Help platform for that very reason. As part of our plan to support students, our government will also be investing $40 million to create 5,000 positions for students at the post-secondary level. MyTax is an organization that fosters collaboration between the private sector and students. It helps to form and to train new students. And normally, the MeTax programs are for people at the master's or PhD level involved in research. But the funding we're providing today will allow them to extend the scope of their programs in order to include people at the undergraduate level or people studying law or medicine. For example, one of their new programs will allow MBA students to have contacts with small businesses facing specific challenges because of COVID-19. MeTax will also be able to create new partnerships with organizations such as hospitals, foundations, and municipal governments to create even more options for young people. This is good news, not only for students who will be able to use their knowledge, but also for business owners and the future of our country. Innovation is more and more important within the global economy. In order to ensure the vigor and resilience of the Canadian economy, we must invest in research and particularly in young people. We have to ensure that young people have the tools they need to work, innovate, and succeed in tomorrow's economy. That is why our government will be investing in the Summer Jobs program to add 10,000 placements for students aged between 15 and 30. We will also be supporting the creation of 20,000 other placements for CEGEP and university-level students in sectors in strong demand, including practice sessions for students. And to ensure that young people are well prepared for the jobs of the future, we're also investing in digital skills and computers for schools.
Students are facing unique challenges this summer due to the pandemic. At the same time, many are wondering how they can help in the fight against COVID-19. So today, we're launching the new Canada Student Service Grant, which will allow post-secondary students and recent grads to gain valuable experience while also contributing to their communities. If you're a college or university student, or if you just graduated and you decide to volunteer this summer, you could get a grant of between $1,000 and $5,000. The exact amount will depend on how many hours you've completed. To learn more about this program and find opportunities near you, you can head to the Government of Canada website, where today we launched the new I Want to Help portal. Our government will also invest $40 million to create 5,000 MyTax internships for post-secondary students as part of our $9 billion plan to help students during this crisis. MyTax is an NGO that builds partnerships between universities and industry. With their training programs, internships, and projects, they help shape the next generation of innovators. Usually, MyTax caters to master's or PhD research students, but with the funding we're announcing today, they'll expand their internship opportunities to undergraduate students and students in professional programs like law, medicine, or business. For example, one of their new programs will connect MBA students to small businesses that are facing challenges because of the pandemic. The funding will also allow MyTax to partner with more organizations like hospitals, foundations, and municipal governments to create even more opportunities for young people. If we want to build a strong and resilient economy, we have to invest in the next generation. We have to make sure our young people have the right tools to work, innovate, and succeed in the economy of the future. In this vein, our government will invest in Canada Summer Jobs to create 10,000 new job placements for young people aged between 15 and 30. We will also support an additional 20,000 job placements for post-secondary students in high-demand sectors through the Student Work Placement Program. And to make sure young people are prepared for the jobs of tomorrow, we're investing in the Digital Skills for Youth and the Computer for Schools Plus programs. Minister Baines will have more to say on this later, but here's the bottom line. There are fewer jobs and many co-op, internship, and community service placements because of the pandemic. So if you're a student and new grad, we're creating tens of thousands of jobs for you. We're making sure that you can still learn new skills, gain valuable work experience, make money for the year ahead, and contribute to your community.
Over the years, Canada has shown itself to be a global leader in innovation. Our scientists and researchers are recognized around the world for their advances, whether it's in the aerospace industry, artificial intelligence, clean technologies, or health. And since the beginning of this crisis, we have been able to rely on them to help us to protect the health of Canadians. That is why, in April, we launched a competition to fund research work to stop the spread of the virus and mitigate its consequences for our communities. Today, we can announce that we will be supporting 139 research teams across the country. That represents an investment of almost $110 million overall in research on COVID-19 for the years to come.
We've seen our hard work and sacrifices start to pay off. And to continue on the right track, we need to be thinking not just about the next weeks, but about the next months and even years. And that's what we're doing with today's investments. With that, I'm now happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Prime Minister. We'll now go to the phone for questions. One question, one follow-up. Operator.
Thank you. Merci. First question, Kate Bolangaro, Bloomberg, line open.
Good morning, Prime Minister. You told Bill Morneau to maintain Canada's AAA credit rating in his mandate letter, and one of the big three agencies just downgraded us. What does this say about your government as money managers, and are there any fiscal anchors left to hold on to?
What it says is in this historic, unprecedented pandemic, we needed to help Canadians. We came into this situation with one of the best balance sheets in the G7, and we put that to work for people. We put more than $50 billion into people's pockets through the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. We've supported our entrepreneurs. We've made sure through various programs that Canadians could not only protect themselves through this pandemic, but also hold our economic standing so that when we get out of this, as we restart, our economy will come roaring back. That was a decision that we needed to make, because supporting Canadians is always the priority of this government. Okay. Dans cette pandémie, dans cette crise sans précédent,
and this unprecedented crisis, we had to focus on supporting Canadians. That's why we invested more than $50 billion in the Canada Emergency Response Benefit to allow Canadians not only to make the right decisions to protect themselves during the pandemic and flatten the curve and protect people against COVID-19, but also to allow our workers and families and businesses to come out of this unscathed so that we could return strong after the pandemic. That was the priority of this government, and it will continue to be the priority of this government, investing to help Canadians to get through this.
Follow-up, Kate?
Beijing suggested yesterday it would be open to swapping Meng Wanzhou for the two Michaels. Are you scared doing so would set a precedent and give Xi Jinping more leverage to blackmail you later on?
It is obvious that the first priority of any government is to protect its citizens. And that's why we are working so incredibly hard to bring back those two Michaels who've been arbitrarily detained for political reasons, as Beijing continues to suggest. And that's wrong. But at the same time, our responsibility is to make sure that we're also protecting Canadians into the future. And if countries around the world, including China, realize that by arbitrarily arresting random Canadians, they can get what they want out of Canada politically, well, that makes an awful lot more Canadians who travel around the world vulnerable to that kind of pressure. So we will continue to stand for our strong, independent justice system. We will do everything we can to bring home the two Michaels, and we will continue to do everything we need to do to make sure that all Canadians are protected going forward.
One of the fundamental responsibilities of any government is to ensure the safety of its citizens. That is why we have been working tirelessly to bring home the two Michaels from their arbitrary detention in China. But protecting Canadians means protecting all Canadians, including Canadians who in future may decide to travel around the world, including to China. And if a government understands that by randomly arresting Canadians, they can bring pressure to bear on that government to get what they want, well, then all Canadians outside of Canada become vulnerable. So it is absolutely essential to remain focused on our independent judicial system and to make it clear to countries like China that we will not endanger Canadians in future because of political pressure from them.
Merci. Prochaine question. Operator.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Michel Lamarche, TVA. À vous.
Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. I'd like you to comment on the study that talks about the fact that Canada is the worst country among the OECD in terms of the number of deaths that have occurred in long-term care homes. What is your reaction to that? And also, I'd like to know whether, in your opinion, that will perhaps encourage you to introduce federal rules in these homes. Well, I think that report has confirmed what we've all suspected, which is that Canada is not caring for its seniors as it should. We have seen this from the beginning of this pandemic, whether it is through the challenges in British Columbia at the Lynn Valley Care Centre or the Héron residents in Quebec, or the reports from the CAF about what's going on in Ontario and Quebec. So we're looking at a major challenge in Canada when it comes to caring for and respecting our seniors. I am deeply concerned about this, and that is why for a number of weeks now, every Thursday evening, I have been highlighting that with the premiers, and that's why we offered them $14 billion, including money for our seniors and vulnerable Canadians, so that we can improve the situation. And of course, we hope that the provinces will accept that money and make the necessary changes. But as I also said from the outset, it also highlights the need to have very significant conversations with the provinces, while of course respecting their area of jurisdiction and their own specific responsibilities for seniors' homes. But it's important to realize that somewhere the provinces have failed to properly care for their seniors, and must the federal government play a greater role? Well, I think this is something we will have to reflect on, but at the same time, as we collaborate with the premiers and the provinces. follow-up? Yes, of course. This is an area of reflection that you have been engaged in for a number of weeks and months now. Do you think the federal government is now thinking more about imposing federal rules on all long-term care facilities in the country? And are you advancing in your negotiations with Quebec on the departure of the Army and the introduction of Red Cross personnel? Yes, I can tell you that the conversations have been very positive with Quebec on that transition between CAF members and the Red Cross. As I said at the outset, the federal government will not abandon seniors in Quebec. We will be there to support the province and help it regain control in those long-term care homes. With respect to the conversations that are continuing with the premiers, we need to do better for our seniors, and the federal government is absolutely willing to do more, whether it is through rules that would apply right across the country or with additional funding. We will be working with the provinces to improve things. But it's very clear that we have to do better as a government, as a level of government, as a country, in terms of the care for our seniors.
We will continue to work with the premiers on ensuring that our long-term care centres are properly supported, whether that's by bringing in national standards, whether that's by extra funding, whether that's by looking at the Canada Health Act. There are a range of things that we can do. We will do it in discussion, in collaboration, in respect that it is the province's jurisdiction to oversee care for elders in those long-term centres. But at the same time, what this recent report has shown, and quite frankly what this pandemic has shown from the very beginning, is that the job isn't being adequately done in long-term care centres across the country. We need to do better. There are some great examples of successes, but there are also some terrible counterexamples. And we need to, as a country and as all orders of government, ensure that we are doing better by our seniors.
Thank you. Next question, operator.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Ryan Tumulty, National Post. Line open.
Yeah, good morning, sir. Your rent subsidy program runs out next week, and we're hearing a lot of concerns from businesses about it, about whether or not it might be extended, but also as they're starting to reopen and starting to do business here in the month of June, they're worried they might, in effect, actually do too much business and end up not qualifying for the subsidy, even though they were closed for the entire month of April and May. I'm wondering if you're looking at extending that program or changing the amount that their revenue has to drop to account for that.
As we've said from the beginning, as this pandemic evolves, we are adjusting our programs. It is obvious that programs that worked and were designed to keep the economy shut down so that everyone would stay safe are not necessarily going to be exactly the right programs for an economy that is restarting, for people getting back to work. That's why every step of the way we have been adjusting and looking at adjusting our various programs so that, as you point out, Ryan, there isn't a disincentive to hire or to grow or to be successful. We want all companies, all businesses to do as best as they can, as hire back as many people as possible, to start getting as much profit, as much benefits as they can. We don't want programs to have the counter impact of holding them back because they will lose help that they will continue to need. This is something we are looking at very closely on the wage subsidy, on the rent program, and on other programs as well. We want people to feel like they should be growing as fast as they can and getting the support that they need. Okay.
From the beginning of this crisis, we realized that we would have to adjust our programs as things evolved. Now, certainly the programs we introduced at the beginning to help people to stay home or to help businesses remain shut are not necessarily the specific programs that are appropriate for an economy that's reopening. So we will be adjusting to encourage businesses to create growth and to create new jobs and hire more employees without having to hold back because of a lack of federal assistance. So we know that there is a need for support, but we also want to encourage businesses to succeed and grow, and that's what we'll do.
Yeah, sir, just on another topic, you spoke with the Egyptian president yesterday. There's a Canadian citizen named Yasser Albaz who's been in prison there for over a year, and his family's concerned that he may have developed COVID and is not getting appropriate treatment. I'm wondering if his consular case came up and if you can give any update on that.
Yes, I can highlight that in my conversation with President al-Sisi yesterday, we spoke directly about the case of Mr. Albaz. We will continue to work together, and we will continue as a country to stand up for Canadians in difficulty overseas. We are working very closely with Egyptian authorities on this case, and we'll continue to monitor it very, very closely, hearing very clearly the voices of family members and concerned Canadians about Mr. Albaz's situation. Okay. Oui, dans ma conversation
yes, in my conversation with President al-Sisi, we spoke directly about the situation of Mr. Albaz. We will continue to work together and continue to push for Mr. Albaz's return to Canada.
One more call on the line. Operator.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Mélanie Marquis, La Presse. À vous.
Merci, bonjour,
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. I'd like to come back to the Meng Wanzhou and the two Michaels story. Now, there was a letter addressed to you by former parliamentarians, ministers of foreign affairs, Louise Arbour and others. And in this letter, they're asking for the release of Meng Wanzhou, saying that it would be a possibility, give the opportunity to redefine the relationship between Canada and China. What do you say to those people? I totally disagree with those distinguished Canadians. I appreciate their involvement, but the reality is that releasing Meng Wanzhou to resolve a short-term problem would endanger thousands of Canadians who travel to China and around the world by letting these countries know that that a government can have political influence over Canada by randomly arresting Canadians. That's absolutely unacceptable. We have been working tirelessly to ensure the release of the two Michaels, those two detained Canadians, but we will always stand up not only for the respect of our independent judicial system, but also make it clear to countries like China that we have an independent judicial system and that we will not accept political pressure, particularly pressure that can endanger the lives of Canadians with random arrests.
I respect the distinguished Canadians who put forward that letter, but I deeply disagree with them. The idea of solving a short-term situation by creating a precedent that demonstrates to China that all they or another country has to do is randomly arrest a handful of Canadians to put political pressure on a government to do what we want, even by going against the independence of our justice system, would endanger the millions of Canadians who live and travel overseas every single year. We cannot allow political pressures or random arrests of Canadian citizens to influence the functioning of our justice system. So I respect these individuals, but they're wrong in their approach.
Yes, as a follow-up, This is a point of law. They're saying, well, Brian Greenspan says in his legal opinion that the Minister of Justice has the power to intervene right now in the judicial process. It's not necessarily interference. He doesn't need to wait till the end of the process. Do you share that interpretation of his powers? Or perhaps you could say what your view is. Well, I won't go into any legal details, and I don't need to do that either, because whatever the tools we can legitimately use, the result would be the same. China could put enough pressure on Canada to have us release one of their citizens, and that pressure would have been applied by arbitrarily detaining 2 Canadians. We cannot allow China to believe that that's the way they can work with Canada, either now or in future. We have an obligation to show that our judicial system will operate independently and free of political interference from China or any other country. And we have to demonstrate that the way you get what you want from Canada is not by arresting Canadians who are traveling. That's an extremely important principle that we must follow.
Bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau. Philippe Vincent Foisy de Radio-Canada.
Radio-Canada. Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. A question on health transfers and support for long-term care facilities. I was listening to what you said to my colleague, but I'm not really understanding what you're trying to say. Yes or no, is there a need for federal standards to apply to long-term care homes in Canada? Well, there's no doubt that there need to be more standards, there needs to be more rigor and better protection for seniors in our long-term care centres across the country. Things have to change. There has to be an improvement. Now, what form could those improvements take? Well, I think on that note, we have to have conversations with the premiers, because it is their responsibility, and they are the ones who have failed to properly protect our seniors during this pandemic. Now, can the federal government play a role? Yes, absolutely. Must it play a role? Well, let's talk about it with the provinces. I do not have any desire to interfere in the province's area of jurisdiction, but obviously the provinces need additional help in order to properly serve our seniors, and therefore we will be there to help. How will we help? Well, that's where our federation operates, based on discussions, collaboration, and negotiations. And that's exactly what I will be doing this evening when I sit down with them. You talk about help.
One of the things that is very clear is that our current system of supporting our seniors across this country has not worked. It is a provincial responsibility, so it is them who have failed to support our seniors. But of course, the federal government is happy to be there to help. We want to respect provincial jurisdictions, but I think we know things need to change. Do we need national standards, or do the provinces just need to increase their standards significantly to reach an equivalent level across the country? These are conversations we can have with the premiers, are conversations that we've had on an ongoing basis every Thursday night for the past 15 weeks. The federal government will be there to help for our seniors. How exactly we do that? Well, in our federation, because of the constitutional division of powers, we will work in consultation, in respect with the premiers. But we know Canada as a whole, all levels of government, need to do better for our seniors, and we will be there to do that.
Mais les provinces disent que ça prend pas
But the provinces are
nécessairement
saying that there's not necessarily a need for more standards. There's a need for more money for health care. I know you said you've increased transfers, and I know that you have also put $14 billion on the table, but the provinces are saying that the federal government has to support 25% of health care costs. Are you prepared to say that you will do that? Will you provide 25% of the costs to the provinces as they are demanding? Well, I don't intend to negotiate in public. I have said to the premiers of the provinces that, yes, we are open to having a discussion that will continue this fall on health care transfers. I think the COVID-19 experience has made it clear that has to happen, but we'll also see where those conversations take us at that time.
With CTV National News. Quebec has said that they will no longer publish daily case counts, death counts, or testing numbers starting on Friday. Doctors are saying that this is a lack of transparency that poses a risk to public health and fuels mistrust of the public in the middle of a pandemic. Will you ask Premier Legault to change this decision? And what message do you think that this sends to Canadians who are being told that the risk of COVID-19 is still very present?
I think every province makes its own decisions about how transparent it needs to be and how much it will provide data and information to its citizens. I think there are probably examples. I think of PEI where there haven't been a case in many, many weeks. I doubt that they're feeling like they have to publish case numbers every single day. They may well do it. I don't know. In Quebec, there's still very much a significant number of cases every single day, significant numbers of deaths, unfortunately, every single day. And I certainly hope that Premier Legault would continue to be transparent and open with Quebecers and indeed with all Canadians, as he has been from the very beginning. I
believe that, well, first of all, we recognize that the provinces all have different circumstances. Prince Edward Island has not had any cases for many weeks, so they may not be publishing daily accounts and daily numbers when those numbers remain at zero. But I think that in Quebec, we are continuing to see new cases every day, and it's a question of looking at how the situation is evolving. And I hope that Premier Legault will continue to be open and transparent with the citizens of the province, as he has been from the beginning. I think it's reassuring for citizens, and it's also important for scientists and researchers to see exactly what is happening in this pandemic.
23.3 of the Extradition Act allows the Justice Minister to intervene and stop an extradition. Did you know about this provision when Meng was detained? And if so, why do you continue to say that Canada cannot intervene when the legislative power is there? And if you're not going to use that power, what other options do you have if China has already hinted they'd be open to a swap?
We're in a situation where, first and foremost, the priority of any Canadian government needs to be to keep Canadians safe, which is why we're working incredibly hard to bring home those two Michaels who have been arbitrarily detained. China itself has admitted that there is a direct link between the detention of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor and the arrest in an extradition process of Meng Wanzhou. We have an independent justice system that is going through its process. And yes, there is, and has been from the very beginning, a element of that that involves input from the Justice Minister at the appropriate time. However, the bigger question is whether or not we want China or other countries to get the message that all they have to do to get leverage over the Canadian government is randomly arrest a couple of Canadians. That not only puts Canadians in difficulty now, but puts them in difficulty and in danger in the coming years. We need to continue to be absolutely crystal clear that Canada has an independent judiciary, and those processes will unfold independently of any political pressure, including by foreign governments. We deplore what China did in arbitrarily detaining the two Michaels, in directly linking those arrests which came a few days after the arrest on an extradition treaty of Meng Wanzhou to each other. And we will continue to remain steadfast and strong and say very clearly in our actions and in our words that randomly arresting Canadians doesn't give you leverage over the government of Canada anywhere in the world. Nous déplorons
We deplore the fact that China has linked the arrest and has chosen to arrest 2 Canadians randomly and unjustifiably following the arrest as part of the extradition process of Meng Wanzhou. Now, it is our obligation to make it clear to all countries around the world that this will not allow them to have any influence over the federal government if they decide to randomly arrest Canadians. If we were to allow that, we would be endangering and making millions of Canadians vulnerable who travel.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Olivia Stefanovich, CBC News. There are 2 lives in the balance here. How do you explain to the families of the 2 Michaels that your government can but won't intervene in the extradition process, which could lead to the freedoms of these 2 Michaels, and by not acting, they could languish in Chinese detention for years to come?
I have met with a number of family members, and I feel deeply for not just the 2 Michaels who are in a very difficult situation, but their families who have endured a year and a half of difficulties with this arbitrary detention by Chinese authorities. But it is not just the 2 Michaels who are at question here. It is every Canadian who travels to China or anywhere else overseas. If the Chinese government concludes from this exchange and this interaction that it is an effective way to gain leverage over Canadians and over the Canadian government to randomly arrest Canadians, then no Canadian will be safe going forward. So I understand the difficulty and the heart-wrenching ordeal that these 2 Michaels are going through right now, but always, I need to focus on, and our government needs to focus on, what is going to keep Canadians safe into the future. And to demonstrate to China that they can just arrest Canadians and get what they want out of Canada, even for us going against the independence of our judicial system, would be absolutely unacceptable. I
understand just what a terrible and trying situation this is for the 2 Michaels and their families. I have spoken to the members of their families, and I know this is a very, very painful time for them. But my responsibility goes beyond those 2 Canadians. There are tens of thousands of Canadians who travel to China every single year. There are 3 million Canadians who live abroad at all times. And those Canadians would be vulnerable to random arrest if countries around the world and governments around the world were to conclude that the way to get what you want from Canada is just to arrest a few Canadians and give them some grief. So we have an obligation to stand up for the independence of our judicial system, for respect of our international treaties, and to not allow ourselves to be influenced by the arrest of 2 individuals, because otherwise we will be endangering many, many Canadians in future.
There have been suggestions Canada revoke visas for Chinese students studying in Canada if they have close ties to the Chinese Communist Party, or that Canada target Chinese officials through the Magnitsky Act. Would you consider that?
As we've said, we're looking at a range of options and of measures, and we're continuing to exert various actions in order to bring back those Michaels safely. We will continue to work extremely hard and look at all different ways to ensure that we bring these Canadians home. We have, over the past number of years, demonstrated significant success in standing up for Canadians in trouble overseas. We will continue to do everything we need to do to bring them home without further endangering Canadians in the future.
As I said, we will continue to explore all possible options in order to bring the two Canadians home, but we will not endanger Canadians who may travel to China or elsewhere in the future.
Global News. Those 19 eminent Canadians who signed the letter say that the Canadian foreign policy is essentially frozen while the two Michaels are being held in China. Do you agree with that assessment?
On the contrary, we continue to engage substantially around the world and with China on many different issues. But it is certain that this issue of China trying to exert political pressure on Canada by having arbitrarily detained two Canadians in response to us fulfilling obligations under an international extradition treaty is causing a challenge in our relationship. We need to demonstrate that we have an independent judiciary, and we will continue to respect that independent judiciary regardless of the pressure put on us by foreign governments. And that's why, even as we do everything we can to bring those Michaels home, we will not give in to these political pressures and compromise the independence of our judiciary or allow others to conclude that there are political paths to get what they want out of Canada's independent judicial system.
We will continue to do everything we must do to bring home the two Michaels, but at the same time, we continue to be engaged on other issues with China, and certainly that is something that is affecting all of our conversations. But it's an extremely important time for us to demonstrate that we will not accept being the subject of political pressure if it will compromise our independent judicial system.
Minister, Nick Taylor-Vasey from Maclean's. Canadians have a lot of questions about how the RCMP conducted itself as a mass shooter terrorized Nova Scotians last April. Everybody seems to agree that answers to those questions are necessary, but so far they don't seem to be coming anytime soon. Will the government call a public inquiry into the shooting?
There is obviously an ongoing RCMP investigation into what actually happened in terms of the shooting, but there are many questions about the role of domestic violence, about the situation where the shooter was able to get his hands on police vehicles and kit. There are many larger questions, and we are working with the government of Nova Scotia to ensure a process whereby those questions get answered for the families, for the communities, for Canadians across the country. And we certainly hope to have things to announce in the coming days. Okay.
Of course, there are many questions about exactly what happened in Nova Scotia. An investigation is ongoing, looking at the circumstances of this event, but there are larger questions as well in terms of the role of domestic violence and how this individual could have been able to obtain RCMP vehicles and so forth. And we are working with Nova Scotia on a process that will allow us to find those answers openly and transparently, and we hope to have more to say about that in the coming days. Thank you very much.
Okay, that is the Prime Minister of Canada on this Thursday. Took me a minute. Making a lot of detailed announcements around the student aid package that had been announced back in April, a total of $9 billion. But this announcement today really giving more specifics on how the volunteer grant program would work, and an announcement that the government is creating thousands of jobs and placements for university and even CEGEP and high school students in the months ahead. So there will be some employment opportunity for young people coming very soon. I'll bring in my colleagues, the host of Power and Politics, Vashi Capellas, and the CBC's Catherine Cullen. Obviously, we'll want to talk about China, but I will do the student part first because I know lots of people are looking for that information as well. So the volunteer program, which will give you access to $1,000 to $5,000, starts today, and it ends at the end of October, Vashi.
Yeah, and I think that the Prime Minister said you can qualify for work done between June 15th or June 18th rather and September 15th. Yes, June 18th and September 15th. I looked at the website that he called up to get some more details on exactly how much you can qualify for, like what kind of things you have to do to qualify for it. It sounds like it's $1,000 per 100 hours volunteered. And so if you're in between markers of 100, so say you've done 150 hours, you would not qualify until you reach 200 for 2,000 and so forth. So it looks like those parameters are pretty clear. There are some questions. I know the website says, for example, that you qualify as of June 25th, and the Prime Minister said June 18th. So trying to get some clarification.
I'm told that was a typo, the June 18th. Good. So it does start today.
Okay.
And it ends at the end of October. Yeah.
So my guess is, and I'm seeing some responses to the tweets that I put out, that there is some concern that, for example, volunteer hours prior to that, because of course, for many university students, they would have been off as of the beginning of May, perhaps even a bit earlier, won't qualify towards that amount of money, but that is the parameters that the government set out today. So I imagine the website is iwanttohelp.org. I just Googled I want to help, and it was one of the first things that came up. So that does have a lot more details, and I'm sure we'll be continuing to get reaction to some of the parameters around eligibility. I should also mention, if you're on the student benefit, so if you're getting that $1,250 a month, you can still qualify for this in addition to that. However, if you're accessing CERB, we were talking about earlier how about a fifth of the people who've applied for CERB are basically within that 15 to 24 age range. If you are accessing CERB, it doesn't look like you'll also be able to access this. So you got to be on the student CERB in order to get this volunteer benefit as well. If you're on the regular CERB, you won't be able to. So those are the details that I...
Okay, and if you don't have a job, there's 10,000 new job placements if you're between 15 and 30. There's 20,000 student work placements. There's a new program where you could do internships at an organization called MyTax. So you'll want to go on the website, I think, if you're a student and you're looking for places to make money or do work over the summer, because lots more has just suddenly become available. Okay, I'll shift to China now, and I'll get you both to weigh in on that, obviously. The Prime Minister facing many similar questions about his response to that letter from those well-known Canadians and the pressure by them, and I would say others as well, that perhaps the solution to getting the two Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor released is to also release Meng Wanzhou. And the Prime Minister, as we all suspected, his tune didn't change much there, but his language was quite tough, Vashi.
Yeah, and it was very specific to the content and the names on the letter, because he was asked, as you mentioned, a number of times. These are 19 very prominent political figures in this country. He said he deeply disagrees with them. He respects them, but he deeply disagrees with them. I respect these individuals, but they're wrong in their approach. And he was emphatic over and over again. Should we do what the letter in part suggests, which is end extradition and the extradition of Meng Wanzhou, the extradition proceedings, that would essentially be handing leverage to China over the federal government and telling them if they are, and I'm using his words, arbitrarily take two Canadians, that they will get what they want from the Canadian government. And he went on to say that that would further endanger any Canadian who traveled anywhere in the world. So that was the thesis that he put forward over and over again. I thought that, I think you're right that it's what we expected to hear from him, but I do think that the language has sharpened, most certainly, in the past few weeks. And that's interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, the primary criticism of the Prime Minister so far on the file of China was that he was not tough enough on the country, right? And that criticism primarily comes from the right. It has definitely come from various candidates for the Conservative Party leadership, as well as the current leader of the party, Andrew Scheer. This language was, again, it's the same gist of things that he said before, but it was more punctuated. I think that's fair to say. I also thought our colleague Olivia Stefanovic had an interesting question, because while the Prime Minister was emphatic today and was very specific specific. I think there is this area of questioning around, you heard him say that they're working very hard behind the scenes, right? That they are working on a solution. But what we've heard from the family this week, and even those 19 individuals who signed the letter, to be fair to them, was there is, what else is it, right? What else are you doing behind the scenes? And I know they don't want to disclose too much and endanger further the lives of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, but various people have suggested, okay, you can sanction, for example, certain Chinese individuals. You can revoke visas of others. There are other tools that you could use that could, in fact, back up the kind of language that the Prime Minister used today. But so far, and today he seemed reticent as well. I mean, he said we're considering a lot of things, but the government has not been specific. So other than they are working hard behind the scenes, we really don't have any specifics. They're not willing to consider this option put forward by the legal team, or by that legal opinion, and by those 19 individuals, which is intervene now and stop things. But what else are they willing to consider or act on to back up the kind of rhetoric that the Prime Minister used today? That's where I envision, I think, the conversation going past today. I think those are fair questions for the Prime Minister. He didn't have a lot of answers on that today. At the same time, his language today was very clear. I don't think there is a chance in the world that they are going to look at that option put forth by that Greenspan legal opinion, or what is suggested in that letter by those 19 individuals.
Or even now by China, and China making the suggestion that a swap of some kind would be possible. It confirms what the government has been saying from the beginning, Catherine, and that is that this is a tit-for-tat situation, that these two men have been arbitrarily detained, that the reason they were arrested was because of Meng Wanzhou and that detention and extradition order. I mean, China has now made that connection very clear, and so the Prime Minister then can actually use that, I think, in his language to admonish the Chinese for doing that, for making this arbitrary detention that he would suggest has nothing to do with anything else.
Indeed, and he has been certainly he has been saying it's obvious to Canadians that is linked for some time. And I think really, following up on what Vashi just said there, the Prime Minister didn't just close the door today to releasing Meng Wanzhou from the extradition process. He slammed that door closed. And he has, in his statements today, really made it, I think, in many ways impossible for him to reverse himself on that position, because he has explicitly linked this particular course of action being recommended by these 19 prominent Canadians to endangering Canadian lives. He says, if we do this, it puts millions of Canadians at risk when they travel abroad. So that option is entirely off the table. There were a few other things I thought were interesting in there. I was struck early on when he tried to explain the balance that he is trying to strike here. He talked about it as being the short-term problem versus the precedent it would set. And in that moment, I thought, it is just very painful to think of the families of the two Michaels who have to hear all of this and consider the fact that the situation that their loved ones are facing now, I believe it's 563 days that they have been in detention in China, that it is ultimately on some level a short-term problem. Now, the Prime Minister did express compassion. Later, he talked about the difficulty of their situations, that it is a heart-wrenching appeal, that this is the government's #1 priority. But I think we do all everyone in Canada really takes a moment of pause and considers the challenging situations that these men have been through. As Vashi rightly says, the question becomes, so what are you going to do about it? There has been growing pressure on the Prime Minister to get tougher with China. He didn't close the door today to sanctions or to revoking visas for Chinese students who might have connections to the communist regime. But in terms of new moves on the public front, we certainly didn't learn anything today. It does, though, perhaps send a very strong message to China that if they thought the government was going to pursue this path, it's a no-go.
I was thinking as we were listening to him, though, that it did remind me of a press conference he gave at their first cabinet retreat in, I believe, 2016, where we learned that a Canadian had been killed after being taken hostage. John Risdale had been killed. John Risdale and Robert Hall were both taken hostage by a terrorist group in the Philippines. And at that point, the Prime Minister made it very clear that this was a government that was not going to pay ransom for Canadian hostages. and I make that connection. I know some people do believe that the two Michaels are essentially diplomatic hostages, but I make that point because the language is the same. In that instance, the Prime Minister said, we're not going to pay ransom because we don't want to endanger the lives of other Canadians abroad. And we feel that entering into negotiations around ransom would do that. And this is sort of the same point he's making here in a different situation. And that to me is interesting because although the government has this strict policy on not paying ransom, they do and have done in the past many things behind the scenes to try and get Canadians released if they are kidnapped. And further to that point, and I'll go back to you, Vashi, and then get Catherine to weigh in too, it is interesting that Robert Fowler himself, someone who was taken hostage, was one of the people that signed that letter as someone who felt that he had to do something to try and get these two men released. I just think it's an interesting position for the government to be in again here. Although not hostages, they are definitely being held prisoner for reasons that nobody understands, and certainly not their families, Vashi.
Yeah, and I think if I remember correctly, that was in Kananaskis in Alberta.
Yes,
and I think
it was,
we were both there. And I remember very clearly the Prime Minister saying exactly that. And I remember in discussions that I had following that, that was I think you're right, in 2016, so it wasn't too far into their original mandate. And I remember in like maybe the next 6 months, picking the brains of people who surround him, and them very clearly telling me by far and away that is the hardest thing that he had to say and do as Prime Minister in that sort of beginning part of his mandate, and that it had weighed on them and that government more than they would have ever imagined, a decision they would have to take weighing on them. I mean, it's understandable, it makes sense, but I just remember that context very clearly being offered to me. The second point I have is...
Can I just say, Vashi, to correct myself, that both men were killed. I think I suggested they weren't, but yeah, John Risdale and Robert Hall, that was my mistake. And both men were killed in the Philippines by terrorists.
And I remember covering it. I remember the sort of apprehension as they said that, well, what would that mean? And it was not a huge amount of time in between that awful outcome and when the Prime Minister had made those statements. And you're right, he was as clear then on that position, which is very similar, evocative of the position he espoused today, as clear then as he was today. The second point I would make is other governments have said similar things, right? It's supposed to be a longstanding policy of the federal government, period, regardless of party, in this country not to pay ransom in exchange for Canadians who have been taken hostage. But there has been a lot of reporting, I haven't done it personally, but I have consumed it, about, as you rightly point out, Rosie, the things that are done behind the scenes. So while the government is probably not paying the ransom, in many cases it helps facilitate others doing so or helps organize it. And there are many instances of that reporting, but the government has never really come out and said, yes, we did A, B, or C, and confirmed that, right? Like that is the public posture of the government for ages, and it continues to be, as we heard today. So I think both those things are important to keep in mind. I have found it particularly difficult to figure out exactly what is happening behind the scenes when it comes to the two Michaels, more so than even back then when I was trying to get information on what they were doing behind the scenes in the Philippines. As I recall, there was a whole bunch of the military was involved to a certain degree. There was intelligence involved. Like there were very concrete efforts being made behind the scenes, and I think clearly there's stuff happening here as well. It's just not as evident, I guess, at this point. Maybe it will be down the road, but it is more difficult, I find, to figure out exactly what they are doing. And in the absence of that information is why you get conversations, I think, like the one instigated by this letter and by these 19 individuals, right? One of the points that they make, and it was put to the Prime Minister, is because of Meng Wanzhou, because of this, there is a lack. It has sort of overtaken the government's ability to articulate its specific foreign policy towards China, and this has overtaken all that. That is one of the clear points that they make, and I think it's understandable why that point is making, because there isn't a huge amount of information coming out from the government on this. I will say the reasoning I get is that that kind of information would further endanger Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, but I understand the question as well.
I would just add,
yes,
if it's all right, Rosemary, that I think those those parallels are very important, and you both raised some very good points, but I think it's also important to look at where the parallels diverge, right? Which is, in this instance, we're not talking about dealing with a terrorist entity or even some kind of government of a failed or failing state. We're talking about the government of China and the political context around Canada's relationship with China and the global relationship with China. We look at the United States, of course, and the back and forth that we've seen with the President of the United States. Any concessions that the Canadian government would be willing to make to China in order to get these two men back would certainly come under incredible scrutiny. And I just think that the broader political context and the fact that this is a state and a very powerful one that we're talking about, that is an important part of this dynamic too, and only further really complicates the situation.
Yeah, I mean, my point of obviously, if you're dealing with a major economic force in the world, it's not similar. My point was simply that things did happen behind the scenes in the case of hostage takings, real concrete things, and perhaps there are things happening here. But yes, I take your point. It is far more complicated to discuss some sort of outcome here that would be acceptable to Canadians when you are dealing with a Chinese government that is unwilling to discuss why these men have been detained for no reason unless they can get some sort of action on behalf of their own citizen, which again, as the Prime Minister has made clear, is really a part of the justice system and the cycle of how that will unfold now. So anyway, it's very complex, needless to say, but it's interesting to see the mounting pressure on the government and the Prime Minister this week because of Michael Kovrig family's decision to speak about this, something that they hadn't wanted to do until now. And that may speak indeed to their lack of hope or their sense of desperation as time goes on here. I'm going to put you both on pause for just one moment. Thanks for weighing in on all of that, though, and talk now about volunteers, because that is indeed part of what the Prime Minister talked about today, how young people volunteering over the course of this pandemic may, in fact, be may qualify to also earn money until the end of October by doing that. Cyber Seniors is a program that pairs young volunteers with older Canadians to give them the skills and equipment they need to connect online. Obviously, especially important in these times. As we heard, though, from Justin Trudeau, it's also a program that's become important for young people because it could potentially be a source of money-making for them. My next guests are both involved in Cyber Seniors. Jean Bartle is in Toronto, and Jaya Sharma is a volunteer teacher, and they both join us from, Jaya joins us from Oshawa, Ontario. Good to see you both. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Hi. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so Jean, let me start with you as the senior in Toronto. What you've been helping volunteers get going. You've been using this program. Tell me a little bit about your experience.
Well, I signed on in the middle of April because I was interested in improving my skills, and I realized how little I knew. I retired 13 years ago. We had a Cyber Seniors program at our church, Kingsway Lapton, organized by Donna Lee Waymont. And when we came back from Florida at the end of March, I said, I guess everything's canceled for this spring. And she said, oh, you should go on to cyberseniors.org. They're every day free programs. So I have been on every single day since the middle of April. And every day it's a different topic. And I have learned so much. And I've realized, cybersecurity, telemedicine, media fact checking, passwords, simple things like when you're on Facebook, don't let them save your password. You should log in each time and log out each time. And you need stronger passwords. And I said, but I've got 10 passwords. I can't remember them all. And then I was taught how to create a password that is very strong that only I will remember with about 18, 19 letters in it. And if anyone wants to know about that, I'd be happy to share. But it has been mind-boggling. And the people that are the volunteers are high school students. When I first met Connor, and I said, now, where are you from? He said, I'm from Hamilton. I said, oh, are you at McMaster? He said, no, I'm in grade 9. And I said, oh, what are you going to do when you graduate from high school? I said, I'm going to take computer science at Waterloo. I said, I think you'll know more than your professors, Connor, when you get there. What impresses me, Rosemary, is how very patient these young people are. When I was 15, I would not be patient with someone, my age who couldn't understand. As I said to Connor at one point, I guess it was Google Docs, I said, Connor, because any questions at the end, so I raised my hand and I said, I retired 13 years ago. I had a reasonably successful career. I have 2 degrees and I'm a member of the Order of Canada. And I feel as if I'm starting junior kindergarten with a major learning deficit. May we please go back to one that, half an hour ago when you clicked at the top left-hand corner and scroll down. Could you explain to me when I scroll down what I clicked? I mean, it's just a whole new world. These young people are so patient and bright and kind. And I've met people from Quebec, Calgary, Missouri, Minneapolis. And,
That's great.
Macaulay Cassidy, who runs this, I said, Macaulay, where are you? I'm in Toronto. Oh, really? Where? At Bathurst and College. I said, you're 10 minutes away from where I live, and yet we've got people all over the
Well, Jean, let me get one of those volunteers in, Jaya Sharma. I'm not sure if she's done any work with you, but she's certainly done work with people like you. Jaya, tell me why you wanted to volunteer and help people like Jean out. So really smart people that feel like know lots of things, but just don't know, how a Google Doc works or some of the little tricks that young people are just better at. Jaya.
First off, I wanted to get involved in volunteering because with all these cancellations, I wanted to do something productive over the summer and hopefully something that can help out in some way. And then so I found out about this program and I thought, wow, something that's so intuitive for me can really help these seniors, and they pick up on it pretty well usually. And so I decided to get involved, and I just did the training, and since then I've been doing 3 or 4 sessions a week, and I just find it's a great way for me to brush up on skills and even sometimes learn other things that I haven't learned. Sure. And also just to talk to these seniors and hear about their life experiences, as we just heard. What do they mostly want to know, seniors? What is the sort of the top issue or problem that they have? A lot of it's about security. So some seniors will be worried about not sharing their information online. So we teach them ways so that they can feel secure that they're not endangering their information somehow by using social media sites or other things like that.
And Jean was talking about how patient everybody is with her. Do you feel like you have to be patient, or what is your experience with seniors?
Well, so far, I've only been doing it for a few weeks, but so far, I think that patience is required, but I find that the seniors are really eager, and some of them are taking notes throughout the entire session, so they're definitely willing to learn. Mm-hmm. And so I think that it's not as frustrating as people might think it is, because there is a range of levels. So some people know a lot of technology and even help us answer questions, but then there's people who have just begun. But I think through all of the people involved in the program, they really do want to learn how to use these things. So we haven't run into too many problems like that.
So I don't know if you would normally have a job this summer, Jaya, or is this sort of what you're doing? And we know the Prime Minister is saying that there is volunteer work that might qualify for a salary of some kind. So just tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I was hoping to be a camp counselor again this summer, but that's not occurring. So it is really good to hear that we might get compensated for volunteer work. Just because, yes, normally a lot of the volunteers would be having a paid job.
Yeah. Jean, what is the best thing that you have taken away from this program so far?
That's a very, very good question. I can't believe this program is free for us. Every day a different topic for 2 months, a different topic every day for 2 months, and we're still going. I think what I've taken away, things like telemedicine, media fact checking, it's overwhelming. What I what I really appreciate is that the following day after the presentation, they put the whole PowerPoint online. So what you can do then is go the following morning, say, because the sessions are at 3, and review what has been taught. Because what they teach you in that 45 minutes, it's impossible to remember everything, especially if the topic is brand new to you. So you can review the next day. We started with about 15 people, I think, on the beginning of April. I didn't start till the middle. And now we have, sometimes there's 75 online.
Wow.
And then we have breakout sessions at the end. So you're with a small group, and it's an excellent discussion. I'm overwhelmed. I cannot say enough positive things about these young people in this program.
That's great. Did you know how to do a video call this well when you started, Jean, or is this a recent lesson about how to frame yourself? Because I may have a parent who just gives me his forehead when he FaceTimes me.
Well, I was there 3 months ago. So you should, either your mother or father should join Cyber Seniors.
All right.
And the camaraderie that we have established with each other is an added benefit.
Yeah, that's great. I will tell him to look it up. Thank you both so much. It is a great program and so wonderful to see young people and seniors working together at a time when everybody needs a little extra help. Thank you so much, Jean Bartle and Jaya Sharma. Nice to meet both of you. Appreciate it. Okay, good to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks. We're standing by and waiting, of course, for our briefing from federal cabinet ministers and public health officials happening a little bit earlier today. Everything's a little bit earlier today, but before that happens, do want to talk about something else that happened this week, and that was the third COVID-19 related death amongst migrant workers in southwestern Ontario. There actually are hundreds of workers who have tested positive. The province has announced a new plan for expanded testing on farms. It's also introduced expanded benefits and worker protections. Certainly the federal government early on ponying up, I think, $50 million to try and help the quarantine of many of these some 60,000 or so migrant workers that come from Latin America and the Caribbean to help, mostly in our farming industry, the vast majority coming here to Ontario. And the idea was to help them self-quarantine for 2 weeks before starting work. In spite of that, hundreds have ended up with COVID and 3, all from Mexico, have died. My next guest is the mayor of Norfolk County, where the most recent migrant death was reported. Joining me from Port Dover, Ontario, is Crystal Chop. Nice to see you, Mayor. Thanks for making the time.
Thanks for having me.
So what has been your reaction, I guess, to this latest death? And obviously it's sadness, but I mean in response to things the city could do or things the city might need in order to help these farms.
Well, the death has been tragic here in Norfolk County, and obviously we've seen the other 2 deaths as well in Windsor. And I think it's an acknowledgement. We have to acknowledge that the federal and provincial program has failed the workers. This at the Scotland outbreak, this didn't just happen overnight. You didn't just have 160 workers that came down with this illness that quickly. So. I think what we have maintained from the very beginning is that, the province and the federal government need to step up in the same way that the BC government did and take on the entire onboarding process of the migrant workers as they arrive into Canada. I think that BC has put forth a fantastic example of what can be done. And individual self-isolation, that ultimately is the best way to protect the workers. I think secondly, I think that the workers need to, have the same services provided to them as other Canadians. They arrive here, they don't have an OHIP number, they don't have a doctor. Our own medical officer of health actually became, the physician for 200 workers through the quarantine process. And I think when an outbreak does happen, that municipalities need to be provided with the resources to be able to deal with it.
One of the things that many migrant advocates talk about is the need for these people coming up for years, who do this on the regularly, for them to be made permanent residents, so that they are not fearful that once their job ends, they are deported home. What do you think of that idea? Do you think that might also have a long-term, would be a long-term solution?
I don't personally. I think that there's a lot of other steps that we can take, before that's necessarily the ultimate solution here. Certainly in the context of their residences, and these congregate settings that is becoming. We know that this virus is extremely contagious in congregate settings, and it's not the fault of the farmers or the provincial regulations in the past. We never had, a pandemic. We never had this type of contagious disease previously. So I think it's going to be looking at rules moving forward, that will better protect them, in these environments that they work in.
How important are migrant workers, temporary foreign workers, to Norfolk County?
We bring in more migrant workers than any other municipality in the province. We've already brought in, I believe, over 3,500 workers, and there's, I believe, more than 1,500 that are still due to arrive. They are essential for food production and security for all Canadians.
And is there just not enough labor in your part of the country? Is it that these people are, particularly skilled at it? Is it all these different things?
Absolutely. I think they are skilled. I think that it's, I hate to say it, but I think it's not the type of labor that a lot of Canadians, want to do. And I think our migrant workers come here, they work hard, to provide a life for their families back home.
And what are farmers telling you about what they need to make sure that their workers are better cared for, better protected? Some of it, obviously, the onus is on them. I know, for instance, there have been now just virtual inspections of farms and bunking houses. But what kinds of things would be helpful to employers?
Well, I think part of the challenge with the screening process, and you're not getting the buy-in from the stakeholders that perhaps was expected from the workers and from the farmers. From the workers, I think that even though we are putting, these pay protections have been in place from the beginning, but I think that the latest move by the province is a helpful step towards trying to crack down perhaps on some loopholes or farmers that weren't necessarily complying. But I think that, there needs to be a plan as well for the farmers that if they do have a set that tests positive, what are the resources that are going to be provided to them to be able to handle those workers? Again, the quickest way for a worker to be able to to resume their work is going to be, quarantining in isolation. Otherwise, the virus, will continue to bounce back and forth between members in those congregate settings.
Just last question. I know you've moved into phase 2. I think it's just Windsor Essex that is stuck in phase 1 in this province right now. Do you feel like you're ready for that phase in spite of what's happening on farms and in greenhouses?
I mean, the farm outbreak, even with Scotland, obviously, Mayor Hewitt and I were disappointed when we didn't move into stage 2 at the beginning. The farm outbreaks have, I can't speak for Windsor Essex, but here in Haldeman, Norfolk, they have largely been contained to the farms. And so, that element, I think that our public health team here has done a fantastic job, with immediately getting into that contact tracing and so on. But I think that one of the things you need to look at is why with Windsor Essex, they bring in less farm workers than we do. And this is not a knock on their medical officer of health in any way, but they've had 26 outbreaks and we've had 1. And a big piece with that is our medical officer of health, as you know, has had more strict, rules than any other municipality, which a lot of our farmers have taken exception to. But I think it is also, it is shown that it has stopped additional outbreaks here by minimizing the numbers of workers that are quarantined together in that, initial quarantine period when they arrive. Because with a maximum of 3 workers, quarantined together, if you have one worker that becomes ill, you only have 2 others that you need to separate, as opposed to, a larger outbreak that we're seeing in other areas.
Really good points, Mayor. Very nice to meet you. Appreciate you making the time for us today. That's Crystal Chop, Mayor of Norfolk County. Let's bring you now back here to Ottawa, where government officials are giving an update on the response to COVID-19. This, of course, the Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Teresa Tam.
Over the past week, an average of 38,000 people were tested daily, with 1% testing positive. These numbers change quickly and are updated daily in the evenings on canada.ca/coronavirus. Achieving and maintaining low levels of COVID-19 is very important for minimizing illness and deaths, but it is also necessary to allow public health actions to bring the epidemic under control. If we think about cases and clusters like small fires and public health authorities as the firefighters, then contact tracing and quarantine is like the water needed to extinguish the blaze. The more fires there are to put out, the greater the risk that public health resources will be overwhelmed trying to get to all the fires before the wind shifts and starts an uncontrollable blaze. When epidemic growth is increasing exponentially, as it did at the beginning of the COVID-19 epidemic in Canada, there were too many little fires that quickly merged into a big blaze. This is why closure of social and economic spaces was required, much like a countrywide fire ban, to bring the epidemic under control and not overwhelm the health system. Thanks to the collective efforts of all Canadians in what must be our biggest bucket brigade to date, the big fire is out, and local public health firefighters across the country can now do what they do best: case investigation and contact tracing to control the smaller fires. COVID-19 case investigation involves local public health experts and identifying cases through laboratory testing and conducting exposure investigations to understand how people become infected and who they may have passed the infection to. Contact tracing comes next and involves tracking down every person who may have been exposed to the case, either directly through close contact or indirectly in a shared space like a home or a workplace. The work doesn't stop there. People identified as having COVID-19 need to be provided with education and support on how to self-isolate and not expose others. Similarly, contacts which may be few or many need to be provided with information and support to quarantine and monitor for symptoms. Public health follow-ups need to continue for weeks until people and their contacts no longer pose a risk for spread to others. The success of case finding and contact tracing is in the speed and completeness with which it is done. The less cases and the fewer contacts per case, the faster and more completely new fires can be extinguished. That's where Canadians come in. By keeping up physical distancing and good hygienic practices and avoiding high-risk exposure setting like closed spaces, crowded places, and close contact situations, we can stop new fires from starting as we reopen. Limiting the number of contacts that each have is also important, as it means less fuel for any fires that do start. This will allow public health to rapidly complete contact tracing and keep COVID-19 under control. Canada needs all the volunteer COVID-19 firefighters we can get to help smother the embers by keeping public health practices up and your numbers of contacts down. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tam. Dr. New?
Merci. Bonjour. Aujourd'hui, je vous parlerai un peu de l'importance de la
Thank you and good afternoon. Today I'll say a few words on the importance of contact tracing for maintaining epidemic control. But first, an update on the latest numbers for COVID-19 in Canada. There have been 102,242 confirmed cases, including 8,484 deaths. 64% of people have now recovered. Labs across Canada have tested over 2,518,650 people for COVID-19 to date. Over the past week, an average of 38,000 people were tested daily, with 1% testing positive. These numbers change quickly and are updated daily in the evenings on canada.ca/coronavirus. Achieving and maintaining low levels of COVID-19 activity is obviously for minimizing illness and deaths, but it is also necessary to allow public health actions to bring the epidemic under control. If we think about cases and clusters like small fires and public health authorities as the firefighters, then contact tracing and quarantine is like the water needed to extinguish the blaze. The more fires there are to put out, the greater the risk that public health resources will be overwhelmed trying to get to all the fires before the wind shifts and starts an uncontrollable blaze. When epidemic growth is increasing exponentially, as it did at the beginning of the COVID-19 epidemic in Canada, there were too many little fires that quickly merged into a big blaze. This is why closure of social and economic spaces was required, much like a countrywide fire ban, to bring the epidemic under control and to not overwhelm the health system. Thanks to the collective efforts of all Canadians in what must be our biggest bucket brigade to date, the big fire is out, and local public health firefighters across the country can now do what they do best: case investigation and contact tracing to control the smaller fires. COVID-19 case investigation involves local public health experts identifying cases through laboratory testing and conducting exposure investigations to understand how people became infected and who they may have passed the infection to. Contact tracing comes next and involves tracking down every person who may have been exposed to the case, either directly through close contact or indirectly in a shared space like a home or workplace. The work doesn't stop there. People identified as having COVID-19 need to be provided with education and support on how to self-isolate and not expose others. Similarly, contacts, which may be few or many, need to be provided with information and support to quarantine and monitor for symptoms. Public health follow-ups need to continue for weeks until people and their contacts no longer pose a risk for spread to others. The success of case finding and contact tracing is in the speed and completeness with which it is done. The fewer cases and the fewer contacts per case, the faster and the more completely new fires can be extinguished. That's where Canadians come in. By keeping up physical distancing and good hygiene practices and avoiding high-risk exposure settings like closed spaces, crowded places, and close contact situations, we can stop new fires from starting as we reopen. Limiting the number of contacts that we each have is also important, as it means less fuel for any fires that do start. This will allow public health to rapidly complete contact tracing and keep COVID-19 under control. Canada needs all the volunteer COVID-19 firefighters we can get to help smother the embers by keeping public health practices up and your number of contacts down. Public health thanks you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. New. Now, we'll give the floor to Minister Hajdu. Good afternoon. I'm here today with good news. The interpreter regrets, but unfortunately the quality of sound is not good enough for interpretation.
Grâce à un processus d'examen par le pair rigoureux mais accéléré, les chercheurs canadiens ont pu se mettre au travail rapidement. En mars, nous avons annoncé le financement
In March, we launched funding for 100 research projects. These projects are already showing results. The interpreter regrets again that the sound is not good enough.
Have shown that the drug remdesivir is highly effective in stopping the replication mechanism of the coronavirus that it causes COVID-19. This evidence supports the promise of clinical trials on this drug in patients with COVID-19. Also, researchers at the University of Saskatchewan and Vito Intervac have shown positive results from the preclinical testing of their COVID-19 vaccine candidate, setting the stage for a clinical trial of this vaccine in humans this fall. Today, we are announcing funding for 139 new and ongoing research projects. These projects will be supported with funding of $109 million from the Government of Canada through the Canadian Institute of Health Research and the International Development Research Centre, and from the provincial health research funding agencies in BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia. Canadians can be proud that the scientific community has responded so rapidly. While the process for most funding competitions take many months, in this case, it was done in a matter of weeks, and there were nearly 1,500 applications. I want to thank and congratulate the researchers who will be participating in domestic and international clinical trials, scaling up promising existing projects that will increase our understanding of the efficacy of vaccines, therapeutics, clinical practices, and public health approaches to COVID-19. Their work will help accelerate the availability of high-quality and real-time evidence that can support Canada's rapid response to the global pandemic in order to better prevent, detect, treat, and manage COVID-19. For example, researchers at the Canadian Blood Services will study the antibodies of people who have recovered from COVID-19 to determine and better understand the level of immunity they provide against reinfection. At the University of Manitoba, Dr. Ryan Zaruchansky and his team will determine the effectiveness of anticoagulants in treating complications of COVID-19. And at the University of Alberta, David Marchand and his team will test the ability of an antiviral nasal spray to prevent infection in healthcare workers and others who are at higher risk of exposure to the COVID-19 virus. I know we've talked about this before, but it's very important to say it again. The work of these researchers is immensely important to our country and indeed to the world, because the evidence they're gathering will inform clinical and public health responses, decision-making, and planning here in our country and all around the world. Finally, I want to thank the provincial partners for their contribution to this investment. We know that collaboration is what's getting us through this pandemic in our country, and we know that we can respond more efficiently to the global health emergency when we work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Hajdu. Minister Qualtrough?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Sorry. So good morning, everyone. We know that young people are facing a serious set of challenges during this pandemic, be it interrupted studies, reduced work opportunities, or disruptions to their internships and co-op plans. That's why in April, we announced a $9 billion investment in students that included temporary income support through the Canada Emergency Student Benefit to help students who might have seen their summer job prospects disappear due to the pandemic. We also announced increases to Canada Student Grants for all eligible full-time and part-time students, broader eligibility for student financial assistance by removing expected students and spouses' contribution in 2020-2021, enhancements to the Canada Student Loans Program by raising the maximum weekly amount that can be provided to a student, as well as a 6-month interest-free moratorium on Canada student loan payments. Toutefois, nous savons que nous devons en faire plus pour venir en aide à nos jeunes. Ils sont essentiels pour
The interpreter regrets, but the sound quality does not permit an interpretation.
pour l'avenir. Aujourd'hui, le Premier ministre a annoncé une série de nouveaux investissements destinés à aider davantage les jeunes Canadiens à trouver des emplois rémunérés et à obtenir les compétences dont ils ont besoin pour lancer leur carrière. We are further bolstering our investment in the Youth Employment and Skills Strategy by $34 million to help create more than 3,500 new job placements and internships for young people in high-demand sectors and sectors in recovery mode, focusing in particular on youth who face barriers to employment. We are also augmenting our investment in the Student Work Placement Program. An additional $186 million will help create 20,000 job placements for post-secondary students in their field of study. We have approved 70,000 Canada Summer jobs this year and are announcing the creation of 10,000 more because we know how tough the job market is for young Canadians. This new investment of $61.7 million will get more employers through the door, bringing the total of CSJ jobs to 80,000 jobs until February of 2021. We know from previous economic downturns that students and youth are the last to recover, and in order to avoid consequences down the road, we are choosing to invest in them now. Au fur et à mesure que nous travaillons à rouvrir l'économie.
The interpreter regrets yet again she will not interpret the minister because the sound is not good enough.
Puisque quand nos jeunes travaillent et réussissent, ce sont nos communautés et le pays tout entier qui en tirent profit. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you, Minister Qualtrough. Minister Qualtrough, just so you know, the microphone's a little bit close to your mouth, so it's causing a popping for the interpretation. So just for when the questions and answers commence, if you can just move it away, that'd be great. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. As Canada's Minister of Diversity and Inclusion in Youth, my name is Bardish Chager, and I acknowledge that COVID-19 has impacted every segment of our society, and Canada's youth are no exception. Post-secondary students and recent graduates are facing unique and unprecedented challenges. The pandemic has impacted their studies, their ability to secure and retain jobs, pay bills, and to save for school in the fall. At
the same time, we know that almost half of not-for-profits are grappling to find volunteers when the need for their services has increased and they are struggling to provide services to their communities. And so, we created the Canada Student Service Grant.
This grant will provide between $1,000 and $5,000 to post-secondary students and recent graduates who participate in eligible volunteer service opportunities from today until October 31st. The greater the number of hours volunteered, the greater the grant amount, up to a maximum of $5,000. Post-secondary students, recent graduates, and not-for-profits will come together on the I Want to Help portal. Pour être admissible à la bourse, les étudiants doivent être de récents diplômes ou inscrits à un programme d'études.
To be eligible for the grant, students must either be recent graduates or enrolled in a post-secondary education program leading to a degree, diploma, or certificate. Students are passionate, engaged, and ready to make a difference, and we know they want to help make a positive difference in their communities.
Opportunities range from being an online tutor with Pathways to Education, being a mentor with Grand Frères, Grand Sœurs, also known as Big Brothers and Sisters, or helping kids learn to code with Kids Code Jeunesse. These are just a fraction of the over 20,000 opportunities available on the I Want to Help platform as of today. As the Prime Minister has said, youth are not only the leaders of tomorrow, they are the leaders of today. More than ever, Canadians need their bold ideas, innovative solutions, and their caring hearts. I encourage all students and recent graduates to visit the I Want to Help platform at canada.ca/I Want to Help ou canada.ca/Je veux aider to find opportunities today. Thank you, merci, and we will now take questions.
Thank you, Minister. So as usual, we're going to start with the phone with 3 questions. 1 question, 1 follow-up, and then we'll turn to the room. Operator, over to you.
Thank you. Merci. Our first question, notre première question nous vient de Émilie Bergeron avec Agence QMI. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Oui, bonjour.
My question is for Dr. New and perhaps also for Minister Haidu, if you have something to add. The Quebec government decided that it would no longer publish data on COVID-19, that there would not be daily updates, as is the case right now. They would do weekly updates instead. However, there are still a lot of cases there, and that's where the epicenter of the crisis is. Do you have any concerns regarding this? Thank you for the question. This is Dr. New. I think that it's important to keep track of data. We need to collect everything in a database. It's also important to share this information with the federal government so that we can have a good idea of what is happening throughout the country. Regarding the province of Quebec, well, that's up to public health there to decide the best way to disseminate information. I think that data and information is generally well shared, but the public health authorities of Quebec are going to have to determine the best way to publish information to the general population.
Minister Haidu?
Minister Haidu?
Je suis d'accord avec Dr. New.
I agree with Dr. New.
Émilie, en suivi?
Émilie, follow-up question, please.
Oui, y a-t-il pas un risque
Is there not a risk then that because we won't be getting daily updates that Quebecers will be less careful regarding COVID-19 and there may be a more significant spread? Answer. Thank you for the question. I think that it's important to continue to raise awareness of the general population with the best practices and the public health measures. This is what we always highlight to maintain physical distancing, proper hygiene, wash your hands, wear a mask. If it is impossible to maintain physical distancing in public, these are all things that are important to highlight. I think that, well, I listen to ads on the radio, and the Quebec government is always trying to raise awareness within its population. Now, regarding data on epidemiology and what's going on, I can't comment specifically, but I'm sure that if there is a significant spread, I'm almost certain that the Public Health Authority of Quebec will hold a press conference regarding this specifically, or they will publish the data if there's another spread in Montreal, for example. I think having a weekly update, well, if there's not a lot of change, well, then it can be fine if there's nothing concerning. I think that the Public Health Authority in Quebec will make all this information public.
The question was about, are we worried about, whether Quebec, is only giving information once a week? I think the most important thing, first of all, is that all of the good public health measures, continuing to underline, to emphasize, to educate, to I'd say in French, sensitize the population to what they should be continuing to practice, which is a social distancing of 2 meters, a good hand hygiene. Obviously, I didn't say in French, but staying home when you're sick, wearing maybe a face covering or mask in public when you're unable to maintain that 2-meter distance. Those are all important things to continue to do. And certainly I've seen or I've heard myself, radio spots in which they continue to tell the public that these are important measures to continue to do. With respect to the data, certainly my understanding is that it's all right to give the data on a regular basis, maybe once weekly, but certainly if there was a hotspot or something unusual, an outbreak, for example, maybe in Montreal or some other spot, I'm sure that the officials in Quebec would certainly be transparent and have maybe a special press conference or disseminate the information in the public space if there was an unusual situation.
Thank you, Dr. New. Operator, next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question nous vient de Lauren Gardner with Politico. Please go ahead. À vous la parole. Ms. Gardner, please unmute your line.
So we're just going to take the next question, operator, please.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question is from Micheline Laflamme with Radio-Canada. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Question from Radio Canada. Hello. Today, we asked a question to the Prime Minister regarding the high number of deaths in long-term care facilities in the country. Things are very bad, and he mentioned perhaps having national standards. What elements should be a part of these standards? How can we do better in these long-term care facilities if there are new cases? Answer. Thank you. This is Dr. New here, and we can see if Minister Haidu has anything to add. I think that we need to continue with prevention of infection. There were problems in long-term care facilities in the country, and this is a national tragedy. We need to do more to protect the health and safety of our seniors throughout the country. In all of the provinces and territories, we have followed guidelines to protect residents and staff. For example, workers can only work in one facility instead of working in multiple long-term care facilities. This is a measure that we can put in place. Also, screening of staff and visitors who want to go into these long-term care facilities, and using hand sanitizer when arriving. These are all measures that can be put in place. For example, as well, separating sick residents from other residents who aren't sick. These are good spread prevention measures. They're at the foundation, but all provinces and territories will likely create their own guidelines, their own standards, but nationally, I think following public health guidelines for prevention will be at the heart of all of this. Thank you. Follow-up question?
Okay, if you want to continue watching this press conference, you can do so on our website, CBC.ca. A lot of questions there about Quebec's decision to move away from daily information on the number of cases, testing, infections, and deaths. They say that they're only going to do that now on a weekly basis and have come under some criticism for it. Indeed, the Prime Minister was asked about it as well and seemed to ask the Premier to reconsider that decision. Let's bring back Vashi Kapelis and Catherine Cullen, though, before we go. Just to circle back again to the comments from the Prime Minister, which I must say I do see some Conservatives in particular applauding the Prime Minister's comments on Twitter. Because the language was fairly unequivocal when it came to his response to that letter from 19 Canadians calling on the government to do more and potentially release Meng Wanzhou in order to get back the Canadians who are detained in China. Vashi.
Yeah, he was explicit that he does not agree with them. He respects those 19 individuals, and I should say they are political figures that many people in this country will recognize from all political stripes, everyone from Ed Broadbent to Lawrence Cannon. He respects them, but he disagrees with them. And in fact, the way that he characterized part of one of the suggestions made in the letter to end extradition proceedings against Meng Wanzhou, essentially, and they don't say it as explicitly, but set her free, hoping that in exchange they will set free Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. He described as handing leverage over to the Chinese government and setting a precedent that would essentially endanger any Canadians who travel anywhere. And as we've been discussing over the past few hours, it certainly is evocative of the position. It is a repeat of the position that the Prime Minister has taken right from the start on this particular file, but it is much stronger and more specific language, I think, and that is probably why you're seeing the reaction that you are so far, especially from the right, which I should say, to offer some context, has been the most critical of the Prime Minister for his positioning on China, arguing over and over again, including as part of its own leadership race for the Conservative Party, that the Prime Minister is weak on China, does not take a tough enough stance, and so that is why probably they are, at least supportive of the kind of language that he used today. Now, the secondary question is, of course, what happens to back that up, if anything, and what kinds of actions, rather, is the federal government willing to pursue in that vein? Those questions remain at this point unanswered.
Yeah, it's one thing to talk tough, Catherine. It's another thing to actually back that up with something more. And for now, we don't see that, at least publicly.
Yes, and of course we're going to be very interested to see what the reaction is of Chinese officials to this. We know that their holidays there, we're not expecting them to speak for the next few days, but that is going to be the next important movement in this. And as you say, Rosemary, also the question, if not this avenue, then what to resolve this? As you and Vashi were talking about earlier, there are a lot of questions about what precisely is happening behind the scenes. Of course, any sort of campaign. Some of it may happen in public, but much of it might happen behind the scenes. We heard the Prime Minister being asked today about some other options he has in terms of backing up that tough talk. For instance, revoking student visas for some Chinese students who might have ties to the communist regime. For instance, sanctions. He certainly left the door open to that, but didn't point to any specific course of action. And then in the midst of all of this, of course, these two men and their families, now more than 516 days in detention, their fate, it seems clearly linked to that of a telecom executive being held for extradition here in Canada. She is living in not one but two mansions on $10 billion bail, while these men are in small cells. In some cases, we're told by people who have stayed at some of these facilities, eating out of a bucket and not leaving the room for certainly days at a time. It's obviously terribly sad and concerning, and the solution not apparent to anyone at this moment.
Yeah, and obviously anything the government does or doesn't do, not wanting to provoke a further reaction from China that might endanger these two gentlemen who are being detained. Thank you both very much for all your coverage today. Vashi Kapellas, you can see her later today on her show at 5 Eastern, and Catherine Cullen will be on the National and undoubtedly elsewhere as well. Thank you. Appreciate it. I'm Rosemary Barton. You are watching CBC News Network, and let me hand things over now to my colleague, Suhana Marchand, who will pick up our coverage from here. Suhana.
Thank you, Rosemary. And as we continue our COVID-19 coverage, we start with a look at Toronto, where the mayor, John Tory, is calling for numerous changes to the city's policing system. At a news conference earlier today, Tory said he wants to refocus police resources and allocate money to areas where it's needed most. Here's Mayor Tory.
In order to eradicate systemic racism,